World building is a topic I loathe talking about and yet think of all the time. It's present in the books I write, even the games I design. My previous world building videos were more about the conversation surrounding the topic rather than a how-to, as there's already a bevy of resources covering the basics, from which directions rivers should flow to drawing your own maps. While those videos all are great, they're aimed at beginners, with comparatively few resources for those who want to take things to the next level. Where do you turn once you've learned about planets of hats, the proper placement of deserts, and how to create your own language? Where does one learn about handling world building not as an amateur, but as a professional? To create worlds that are more than a collection of cool ideas, and instead feel deep, alive, and concrete. So that's what I'm attempting today, to create an intermediate lesson in world building. A higher level discussion to deepen your understanding of the subject, with the goal of creating worlds that hold up under scrutiny and can stand shoulder to shoulder with your favorite authors, dungeon masters, and designers. Today we're going to look at the philosophy behind world building, the mental framework we use to discuss it, and the systems we use to accomplish it, all while using real-life examples from my own work. Let's talk about world building. The only metaphor for world building that seems to have stuck is that damn iceberg, which we all know I hate, seeing as I insist on cursing its name. The iceberg was created with good intentions, an attempt to demonstrate that though the reader only sees a few scant details, there's a deeper system of lore that holds it all up. That by creating this vast mountain, a writer can better understand their world, creating a far more stable house, even if the reader only ever sees one corner of it. But this is the internet, and there's nothing the internet loves more than taking good advice, twisting it into the dumbest result possible, and then beating the horse so dead it turns into a fine paste. The iceberg in its current form is more than meme, more than video genre. It's a religious dogma leading writers to believe they need pages and pages of lore for their world, when the reader or player will never experience the vast majority of it. I suspect this is one of the reasons why we see books and video games subjecting us to a flood of proper nouns that never come into play, of names, settings, magic systems, and world history that have no bearing on the story, because they've been taught that more lore is better. The more lore you have, the more real your world must feel, and thus the better people will like it. Meanwhile, the audience feels so bombarded with facts and figures that they become numb to the whole thing and none of it sticks, leaving the world feeling empty and generic. When writers approach world building as a whole they have to dig, the deeper the better, they end up with a loose pile of ideas, a junkyard of half-baked concepts without a unifying philosophy or point of view tying them together. It all ends up just feeling like stuff instead of a cohesive experience, because the writer is looking at world building like an assignment they have to get through, and not a set of themes that ties their series together. Okay, so if we aren't supposed to think of it like an iceberg, how are we supposed to think about it? Drywall. Yeah, that's not very sexy, is it? See, the iceberg works because it's immediately understandable. We all saw Titanic, we know what an iceberg is. But drywall is a mystery known only to construction workers and landlords. Even worse, it's boring. It's just like a wall. But if you stick with me, I think you'll see it makes a lot of sense. Not only in how we think about world building as a tool, but in setting us up to take our world building away from a pile of loose ideas and toward a stable, woven world. We're going to do this by breaking down the metaphor into two further concepts, one of posters, paintings, and studs, and the other of dots, lines, and webs. I want you to picture a wall. Not just any wall, mind you, but a museum wall. You know the ones, off-white paint, featureless, with clear, even lighting throughout. A space designed by its very nature to be uninteresting, to fade into the background and not be noticed. It isn't there to be pretty, it's there to define the gallery, to give it structure. Now, if we were to cut that wall open, we would find it has a structure all its own. Drywall is made up of 3 basic pieces: the facing paper to which things are attached, the fill that provides volume, and the studs that provide stability. All of this exists as a system to define a space, a canvas that a picture will be attached to. The subject of the picture doesn't matter. Lightsabers, temples, monsters, characters, cool spaceships, it can be anything. What's within the frame isn't important. What matters is the wall holding it all up. And that's how I want you to think about your world building. Pictures, walls, studs. Anyone who's lived in their own place knows pictures have weight. You can slap a picture on your wall with tape all day long and it'll hold no problem. But start taping frames and you're going to wind up owing your landlord some of that security deposit. When hanging a picture, we have to use hooks, nails, or drywall screws to hold it in place, providing an anchor for the frame. And for the really heavy stuff, your grand portraits and flat screen TVs, you have to use a stud. You need the strength of the wood to hold all that weight. Obligatory get your mind out of the gutter. This is how you should think about your world building. It isn't a question of depth, it's a question of weight. Those posters, pictures, and TVs are your ideas, your story beats, your cool characters. It's your laser swords, magic wands, mysterious planets, and intricately detailed hyperdrive engines. The level of weight isn't defined by the depth of the idea or how much lore there is behind it. It's defined by how important it is to your story and the characters within the world. Some ideas don't require any weight at all. We never, and I mean never, need to know how a lightsaber works, who was the first to ever craft one, or what the colors dictate. It's just cool. It doesn't matter to your reader, and it doesn't matter to the character swinging the sword. It's a poster, and it can go anywhere on your wall, held up by no more than a fun visual or exciting fight scene. Laser swords are cool, we don't need to question it. Other ideas are heavier, like say Jedi or Witchers. When we're talking about knightly orders, we start to wonder, where did they come from? How are they organized? Who pays the dry cleaning bill on all these robes? These questions that doubt in the reader's mind and the relationships it defines for the characters is weight we have to account for. It's going to require an anchor, a hook onto the wall to make sure it doesn't fall off. And then there's the really big stuff. Spaceships and wars and what are we all fighting for? Magic systems, economic realities, and historical prejudices. These ideas carry an enormous weight. They're the pillars of your world and should be treated as such. They'll define major story beats, characters' backstories, and the central conflict or tensions of your story. So we anchor them into the foundation, attaching them to a stud for maximal support. I think that's a fairly lovely metaphor. Maybe it appeals to me because I will forever be more of an architect than a poet. Metaphors, as useful as they can be to conceptualize a problem, don't do much in the way of instruction. Whether we're talking icebergs, museum walls, or magic 8-balls, how does any of it help us actually build our worlds? How do we turn away from vague philosophical ponderings and toward an actionable system that aids us in building worlds that holds up to scrutiny? How do we put it all into practice? Well, this is where we turn to the other side of the equation, to dots, lines, and webs. I need a drink of water. The dots are your cool ideas, the posters that can go anywhere on your wall, like so many stickers placed on cars and laptops. They add color to an otherwise dull space, stars blinking out among the darkness, filling the gaps with a little bit of light, in the same way that we apply a wash or edge highlighting to a mini. They're the accents, the sprinkles on the donut of life. More metaphor, sure, but one intended to drive home the point that this is all they ever need to be. Dots have no weight, they require no explanation. You can just have a castle that looks like a skull because skull castles are cool. You don't need to explain the anatomy of your dragons. Dragons are cool, everyone likes them, we don't need to question it. Not every idea has to be explained. Not every concept of your world has to stretch deep into the iceberg. Roots all have different lengths, some shorter, some longer, and for good reason. The cool ideas are dots upon your wall, and that's all they'll ever need to be. Picture frames are where things get more interesting because frames have weight and thus require stability. They have to be anchored to our worlds in the same way they're anchored to a wall. We do this through a concept I've come to call bidirectional world building, expanding and stretching the idea forwards and backwards in time, anchoring it into two places on our world building wall. We still start with a cool idea, same as a poster, but we pull it backwards in time, asking ourselves what it looked like before the idea occurred. What was the world state that caused the idea to happen? Then we pull the idea forward in time, looking at the consequences the cool idea has upon the world, the effect that arose out of the cause. Let's look at an example from Eye of Sil. My fantasy world has an England analog called Adderley, with a matrilineal monarchy led not by one queen, but by three, called the Triple Crown. There's no real reason for this other than I thought it sounded neat. It was a cool idea. But this is more than a poster because, one, readers will have questions. Why three queens? How does that work? And so on. And because we're talking about the government of the land. It has influence and implications across much of the setting, and therefore the characters, all of whom are from here. In other words, this is an idea with weight, and weight requires support, so we have to explore it further. I begin by looking back in time, asking myself what would cause a Triple Crown to come into being. I decide that once upon a time there was a patriarchal kingdom with primogeniture, same as any other fantasy kingdom. But then the good king died, having only 3 daughters and no male heir, with the kingdom falling to their evil, dastardly cousin. So the sisters had themselves a little coup. The 3 sisters succeed in taking the throne, but are left with a problem. If they give the kingdom to the eldest daughter, it encourages the other 2 to conspire against her, to take the throne for themselves. Instead, they decide to share the crown, each with their own female heir to replace them. Problems are presented to them as a group, which they argue about in private, presenting their decisions to the public with one voice. 3 queens upon a single metaphorical throne, a triple crown. And I quite liked this idea. It creates a stable system of rotation as the queens age out or retire, one being older and more conservative, one being younger and more progressive, and one in the middle focused on stability. This stretches our dot, our cool idea, backwards in time, anchoring it to a spot on the wall, but a good line needs 2. So we ask ourselves, what is the consequence of this idea? What ripples are caused by the dropping of this particular stone into the time stream? Well, in the real world, there was always this problem of what to do with all those princes not destined for the throne. As the song goes, I am son and heir to nothing in particular. Leaving them just lying around results in them plotting to take the throne or in being dull and lazy, unable to take the vestiges of kingship should something happen to their older brother. They solve this by keeping the heirs busy. One brother gets shipped off to the military, the other to the church. or they'd divide up the realm. This brother takes that province, with the other brother ruling the bits over there, getting the added benefit of on-the-job training, letting them flex a bit of power and wealth before the crown rests on their head. Doubling back to Syl, 3 royal lines means 3 royal households who all need jobs. You can imagine how quickly the nepotism would get out of hand. All of those damnable cousins put in charge of this or that thing, regardless of their actual competence. This in turn bogs down the machinery of government, drains the treasury, and results in a military that can neither win wars nor safeguard the countryside. The nobles would complain, revolt, and eventually would result in a civil war. Now, for my world, I didn't want that. I didn't like that particular effect generated from the Triple Crown cause. So I go in a different direction, one leaning towards an eventual future of constitutional monarchy. I come up with a system of representatives called pleas, and for the governors to be diplomatically elected, but confirmed by the crown. This is why Oriel's father in Eye of Syl is an elected noble, which I guess counts as a spoiler? I can't keep track anymore. These 2 points of the coup that led to the Triple Crown and the constitutional monarchy that emerged as a result of the 3 royal lines frame the original cool idea that began as nothing more than a name. By stretching it forwards and backwards in time, the idea feels more substantive, more real, better able to hold up the weight of the world it's living in. And just like that damn iceberg, it helps me, the writer, better understand my world. I know more about the history of Adderley as a kingdom, and I know a lot more about how its government operates and how that might affect various characters in the world. I even managed to get a hint of it on the page, thanks to Oriel and her father. But the real magic of this system and this philosophy of world building is how these ideas start linking together. The idea that Oriel's father was a politician originally had nothing to do with the Triple Crown. It predated it entirely. There are 5 main characters in Eye of Syl, and I wanted each of them to occupy a different space on the economic spectrum. Adamar is from one of the wealthiest families in Adderley. Severin is from the struggling middle class, with Beralt being from the lower working classes, and Tace being functionally a nomad outside of the economic system altogether. But I was missing something. Someone to fit in that preppy upper middle class, bordering on wealthy space. This is where Oriel was supposed to go. Now, in the real Middle Ages, such a spot would have been filled by wealthy merchants, but this overlapped too heavily with Beralt's character arc. She could have come from the educated classes, but this overlapped with Severin's. I know this is some real behind-the-scenes stuff, but bear with me. So I was working in DC at Customs and Border at the time when writing the book, surrounded by politics and the news. So I hit on the idea of making her a politician's daughter, someone who doesn't fit neatly into either category, neither fully noble nor working class. So I knew she was a politician's daughter, but had no idea how that would fit into the rest of the world. This is, in effect, another cool idea, another dot. And in some ways, it's on a line of its own, the economic spectrum of the other characters. But much like the Triple Crown, it's also an idea with weight because it defines a main character and their background. That weight requires further exploration and explanation. But the really funny part, the magic that ties this whole system together, is that if I look at Oriel's politician father and ask myself where this comes from in the world, what cause would result in this effect, I get the Triple Crown's damnable cousins. The future of the Triple Crown's cool idea is the past of Oriel's cool idea. It's all linked together. And these 2 lines, once connected, reinforce one another, making the world more believable overall. History is another area where this approach really pays off. Fantasy writers love coming up with histories of their world, the 3,000 years of who's-a-what's-its that leads to the current Middle-earth. This is a consequence of thinking with depth and not of weight. of focusing on adding more and more instead of how those pieces interact and influence one another. Back in Eye of Sil, you have Adderley, the English analog, but you also have Clement, which is the French analog, and Roque, the Spain analog, for those attempting to keep score. I wanted Roque to be a region culturally unique, but under the control of Clement, largely so I didn't have to come up with another government. It was an idea born of laziness, plain and simple. Another isolated idea, another dot. Across the channel in Adderley, it always comes back to Adderley because all the main characters are from there, thus making it the core of the setting. Adderley was once divided into 4 smaller kingdoms, eventually conquered and united into one nation, Norman style, led by a king who would eventually be replaced by the Triple Crown. But this raised a question. Where did one kingdom get the resources to conquer 3? They got it from the Roques. We simply tie the two ideas together, reinforcing them both. Roque and Adderley were allies against Clement, and sort of a reverse of the old Scotland-France alliance in our world. When Roque was conquered, the nobles fled to Adderley, bringing the wealth and soldiers of their fallen nation with them, thus giving Adderley the resources it needed to conquer her neighbors. By taking these dots, these cool ideas, and stretching them into lines, we make them far more solid. Connecting those lines to each other interweaves them, strengthening them like the weaving of a basket until it can hold the weight of a world. Just like weaving, this process isn't only a question of left and right, of forwards and backwards in time, but also of up and down, of zooming in and out on a problem. We examine the impacts of all our ideas and how they tie together until it's impossible to tell where one ends and one begins, until we stop looking at them as singular cool thoughts and instead view them as one vast interconnected world that appears all the more real because of it. Let's look at one last example from Eye of Sil and tie all this together. There's a throwaway line in Chapter 11 about the curse of the Binscaith, alluding to a noble family eternally cursed with misfortune. This was just another fun idea I had, something that occurred to me in the moment, tying Beralt and Adamar's histories together, even if only at a distance. But even that throwaway line, that cool idea, ties into the web we've woven. Binscaith is a major city in Adderley, a regional capital named after the family who once ruled it. They were one of the 3 kingdoms conquered by Adderley to form the modern nation. But 3-on-1 odds is pretty tough, even with the reinforcements from Roque. So we leverage some old tropes and decide that once Binscaith saw Roque's reinforcements, they betrayed their allies, joining Adderley against the other 2 in the hopes of a favorable position in the new regime. The history of all these groups, these nations, bounces off one another in a cascading series of cause and effect. And it's this intersection, this impact they have on one another, that makes them feel more real. We take all of our cool ideas and weave them together into one of those red string conspiracy boards, a spider's web of world building that our readers fall into. What you doing, pretty girl? Oh, pretty girl. You have to be nice to Spark. Her mommy just died. Didn't she, baby girl? And now I'm sad. Okay, let's get back. Oh, good girl. Having singular events is all well and good, but by asking ourselves what happened before and what happened after, by asking ourselves how it impacts the other ideas in our world, we create layers and time, a depth that we can explore. Tolkien was an expert at that history part, continually asking himself how names, cultures, and ideas flowed through time, sprinkling them like constellations across Middle-earth. Herbert was an expert of the latter, connecting the ideas of his setting together, asking himself how one area of lore impacted and altered the others, resulting in a universe of interconnected alliances, motivations, and conspiracies that swirl around the fate of a single family, the anchor holding it all together. It's why Dune is a better story of political intrigue than Game of Thrones. But this approach does have two problems. The first is that if we aren't careful, we can end up recreating the junkyard pile of ideas we sought to avoid, generating an infinite cycle of cause and effect. This is something you could accuse Tolkien of with his many lifetimes of lore. But pretty much everything in his story ties back into his characters, into one of the 9 members of the Fellowship in some fashion. The second problem is that over time, these ideas will start to drift from one another. Your lines will get farther and farther apart, your connections looking like messy, tangled knots. This will create inconsistencies and contradictions that your readers will notice, and in time can make the world feel less real or believable than if you had done nothing at all. The second problem, that idea drift, is actually the easier to solve. You need to redraft your world building. Always redraft your world building. I will beat that drum until I die. I made a whole video about it that none of you watched. The redrafting process actually aids in the effort, as it will spark new ideas and help consolidate old ones, ironing out the gaps and making the whole thing feel more solid. The other problem of what to do with all that lore is trickier. We don't want to end up in a place where we ham-fist references into scenes that don't need them, desperate to get them on the page, as that will lessen the impact of both the lore and your story. My solution to this was just to write more books. So even though Thrice Dead Witch was published first, Eye of Sil was actually written first. All of that world building is anchored on Adderley because the 5 main characters come from there. But that book's story is more of a there and back again, dashing across the continent in a race for a magic bauble. I did all this world building for Adderley and then spent like 1 chapter there. I had all this cool stuff I wanted to show the reader and no place to give it to them. So I just wrote an entirely separate book. One that takes place in Adderley and allows me to show off more of the conflicts taking place within it. That's an extreme solution, admittedly, but hey, at least I won't run out of books to write. World building, good world building, goes way past icebergs and cool ideas. It's more than graffiti on a wall or arguing about how a river should or should not flow. Understanding the basics is, of course, important, and it's a great place to start, in the same way that we start out learning about 3-act structures and one-dimensional characters. But as we advance in our journeys as writers, as we begin to approach world building not as hobbyists, but as professionals, we need to review how we think about it, to revisit our philosophical conceptions of how we approach these impossible tasks, to come up with systems for how we create worlds and tell memorable stories. I'm Michael Aguero. Thanks for watching. If you thought my lore sounded cool or wanted to see if I'm as good of a writer as I think I am, consider picking up one of the books mentioned in this video. Thrice Dead Witch and Eye of Sil are available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. If RPGs are more your thing, I made one about the magical wizarding school from this world. That's available over on DriveThruRPG or itch.io. Every bit of support is appreciated. This channel continues to be functionally on hiatus and future uploads will be inconsistent. So subscribe if you don't want to miss anything. You can also follow me on Instagram or Blue Sky, though I post a lot more on Instagram. I might make another office topic video in the near future, but the next big thing on the horizon is the next video game retrospective. No idea when that will be out. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. And there's already, oh, it's going way too fast. Way too fast. What am I even doing? Now it's going too slow. What I got? The other book. Real, the more real. Okay, so if we aren't, nope. Vague, philosophical. They solved it. Now, from my world, I didn't want that. Oh, hit the mic, that was dumb. Real middle whole system together is when my voice cracks. God damn it, I was so close. This is a consequences When Roke was concert to revisit our philosophical conception. Philosophical. I did it again. Philosophical. Okay. Let's see how that went.